Yeah, I did put a couple of charts together comparing Tesla against Ford and GM. I was just talking about debt a second ago.
Hmm.
Uh, in 2018, it looked like Tesla was going to just continue increasing its debt like we've seen other automakers do. Every year they would borrow more and more money, and their long-term debt total would continue to rise over time, as we saw GM do from 2012 through 2018. But Tesla, as they became profitable, started just paying down that debt early, retiring that debt before it came due. And now Tesla has almost no remaining debt. Whereas if you look at Ford, they've had about $100 billion
Wow.
worth of long term debt every year for the past 12 years. Only the past couple of years, they got that paid down a little to about 90 billion. Why did GM start off so low back in 2010? Because the last time they went bankrupt, it was 2008. So when they emerged from bankruptcy after being bailed out by the US government, they didn't have a lot of debt on the new GM. But
Right.
since that time, they've been doing what normal automakers do, borrowing more money every year so that they can front their purchasers the money to buy the car and then get paid back over time through their financing arm of their automaker. That's what most of their debt is for. Also, for loaning money to dealerships to buy the cars from them. So you've got consumer financing and you've got dealership financing going on from both Ford and GM. Uh, Most dealerships do borrow the money when they buy cars from Ford and GM and then pay it back once they've sold the car. So that's
Wow.
a good business model so long as it works, so long as you don't enter, let's say, a high interest rate environment where your old debt at a fixed low rate is now selling at a huge discount. That's not great. And what we've seen from some of these automakers is that they're limiting their production of new vehicles to try to keep the existing fleet of leased vehicles resale value high. So we've seen more and more evidence of that, including in the earnings release from Ford last year, where they admitted on their financing waterfall page um, that that's one of their strategies. Not just them, but Hyundai Kia also came out and said that recently, that they've been limiting production to prop up the value of their leased vehicles so that even if people default on the payments, they'll be able to resell them at and recoup most of their loss.
Yeah. So you just said, I think we should pause here and let's just go right out right now, and then we'll back it up with even more data later. I just think we just go right out, say it. Like, how likely are these companies? Let's pick some of them. How likely they're going to survive? And so you just said that in this case, you showed a graph showing Ford and GM's debt. And what many don't understand is that many of these ICE car companies already are just massive debt now, high interest environment. They're going to be suffering, paying more. And you just saw Alexander's table showing that they're already bleeding in terms of their debt ratio and so forth. And you showed just a few minutes ago cash flow. They're struggling, and that's just one. And then you talked about how they're selling it to dealerships and the financing issues, and these are all coming to freight this next years, next 5 years. What is your tell me the list of things, what you think of their health if you're looking at them objectively, the ICE car companies, and what's your prediction?
Well, corporations in general do not like a high interest rate environment. Companies like to borrow money on the cheap. And as long as those conditions are present, it's easier for companies to make money because they can borrow at a low rate. And then, even if their company doesn't make a very good profit margin, their profit margin is probably better than the rate at which they borrowed. So they can profit from the difference, and it makes sense to borrow more. Or at least that's the traditional way of thinking. That's how they teach you in MBA school, is as long as your cost of borrowing is less than your internal rate of return, it makes sense to borrow. And that's how these companies end up with so much debt in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I don't think I have any special ability to call out which automakers are going to go bankrupt
Mm-hmm.
over the next decade. I think it's likely that some will. There's a reasonable case to be made that Ford or GM are going to need some assistance to make it for the next 10 years. If the economy stays in the same shape that it's in for very long.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're showing the numbers right now, and we're showing the numbers are not looking good for these guys and all these other issues that are happening. Let's go ahead and share some more information that you've got here.
Sure, yeah. So that was the long-term debt chart. Here's the
Yeah.
revenue chart for GM versus Ford versus Tesla. You can see Ford and GM, about between 128 and 256 billion dollars. Why does the scale do this? I put it on a logarithmic scale so that you could see how low Tesla started out. 117 million dollars worth of sales back here in 2010, back when they were only selling the original Roadster. And then as they introduced the Model S, that revenue grew to more than a billion. You know, every time you see the line pass one of these
Mm-hmm.
horizontal lines, that means that
Mm-hmm.
Tesla doubled their revenue. So from 2 billion past
Mm-hmm.
4 billion, past 8 billion, 16 billion, 32 billion, 64 billion. This is a really obvious up and to the right trend,
Mm-hmm.
even on a logarithmic scale. Whereas Ford and GM revenues don't appear to be growing any. They took a little dip here for COVID and for the chip shortage and supply chain challenges that happened in 2021. But they're really only back to where they started 12 years ago at the top line, the revenue line, because they've been discontinuing their least profitable products as this time goes by. There's a lot of sedans Ford and GM used to make that they no longer make because the profit margins were so thin on those. They killed off those programs so that they could have more of their sales mix come from their more profitable pickup trucks and SUVs. So they're not growing the top line, which isn't good for your chances of growing your bottom line profitability. I'll skip ahead to the next slide here. And I've used the most charitable numbers I can find for
Mm-hmm.
adjusted automotive free cash flow here. This is excluding the financing arms for both of these companies to look at just their automotive free cash flows. And so Tesla, you can see, has a very obvious up and to the right trend since bottoming back here in 2017, which was a pretty bad year for all three of these companies. They all went down from 2016 to 2017. Since that time, Tesla has been up every year since, and GM and Ford have had um, some ups and downs over the past 6 years, I should say. So that's just another one of the charts that I put together. And I'll finish with this last one, the fourth one. This is earnings per share. It's a little bit of a chart crime to chart earnings per share because the number of shares issued by each of these companies is different. But that was what John Engel at Almington Cap on Twitter requested of me 4 years ago, back when I labeled GM over 2018, back when the most recent information available showed that Ford and GM put out positive earnings every year and Tesla put out negative EPS every year, right? The other thing I noted on here is that I have adjusted the EPS to exclude the 5-for-1 split that happened in August 2020 and the 3-for-1 split that happened in August 2022 to show, okay, if Tesla hadn't done those stock splits, what would the earnings per share have been? And Tesla would be up to $55 dollars per share
Mm-hmm.
if they hadn't done those two stock splits, which is, I thought, the most the most direct comparison to the question that I was being asked at the time, which is what I was updating these charts for. But yeah, Ford and GM are not growing their earnings every year, and this is what investors want. When you buy a stock, you're looking for a company that you think has really high odds of growing their earnings in the future. Every year, you want earnings growth. That's what you're paying for when you buy a stock. Tesla is delivering that earnings growth since 2017, and these other companies are not.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess what was telling a little bit was, or unless I'm reading wrong, but if you show me again that same graph where you're looking at the total revenue, I guess what's confusing me is that Tesla's only selling, a run rate of 2 million cars this year. These guys have been in business for 100 years, as I said at the beginning. They're selling more than that, and yet their revenue's the same.
Yeah, so Ford and GM are selling, I don't know, 5 or 6 million units a year, something like that. And
Yeah.
Tesla only sold 1.3 million units in 2022 and still generated about half as much revenue as GM and Ford did, even at a much lower number
Okay,
of
gotcha.
units
Yeah,
sold.
that's
Yeah.
that's an exponential scale there on the right. But yes, it still shows that their growth is exponential. So Tesla is going to quickly surpass us any moment. And so not only is Tesla's business
Yeah.
strong, but these car companies are struggling.